This video is explaining how in the paper 1 exam, question 3 can be a comparison of two texts. What I'm going to do is give an example of how I've analysed both texts for language, how they create discourses and how they create representation, and then I'll be comparing the two. So what we'll be able to do by looking at both of these texts, and I'll put a link to the actual texts themselves underneath the video so you can click on that, is how I did it. I've highlighted a lot of language, and it's very unlikely that in the time you've got in the actual exam you'd be able to comment on this much language. But what I'll do is comment on a variety of different types of language, each at different levels of difficulty. So you've got an example of how you could talk about this if it was your comparison. As you can see, I've got a lot of different highlighted colours. You might consider using different highlighted colours for different language effects. It's a good technique. So things that we can talk about. So firstly, in yellow, what I've done is I've highlighted anything that I would deem to be quite emotive. So what the emotions would be. We'll talk about that in a lot more detail when we look at the actual analysis. I've also looked at some metonymy, and we've talked about in orange here, how metonymy, when you refer to something as part of a greater entity, so that can be used. I've also, in this example, I've included some bits in blue, and they're going to be conditional sentences. So that's quite a high level skill to be able to talk about. So we'll be able to do that. And then in green, what I've done is I've highlighted some aspects of modality. So modal verbs and presupposition. And that's probably the hardest thing to talk about when you're talking about a presupposition. But it's really interesting, and it also gives you a lot of points. So this is text A. If you've received this in March, then you'll know what it is. So this was a letter from 10 Downing Street, signed by Boris Johnson, and we'll talk about why this was sent and what it means. Text for comparison is a website page from Mumsnet, which is a website designed to encourage opinion and discussion. It's from a category on the message board that was literally called coronavirus. And this particular thread is called No Point in Lockdown Anymore. So similarly, what I have done is I've highlighted the same bits. So I've put the emotive bits in yellow. I've talked about metonymy in orange. Again, green, I've got that in there. So what we'll do is talk about how these two things compare, and also how these texts show differences in how they create discourses. Because if you want to get a mark that's definitely in band 3 or above, we have to be able to talk about discourses. Like I say, every language feature and every discourse that I've highlighted in this text, you probably wouldn't be able to mention this in a real exam answer because you haven't got time. But that's not the point of this video. The point is, how can you compare the text with as many possible things? So hopefully it's useful, and we'll begin now. Okay, so before we start to actually analyse it and talk about everything we've covered, we'll have a look at the marking criteria, because that's really important. So for level 1, which is marks 1 to 4, you will be able to discuss relevant aspects of the text without making connections explicitly. So effectively what that means is a level 1 answer will talk about both texts without really making any comparisons. For example, not talking about the fact they both mention the coronavirus, or mentioning the fact that it's an emotive issue. Level 2, making connections on a literal level. So at level 2, you're analysing it, and this is the standard good GCSE grade answer. This is when a level 2 answer is saying they're both about the same topic. They come at it from different perspectives. One is saying that lockdown is vital for the public health of the UK, and the other one is saying lockdown isn't working. So it's making a connection on a literal level, but it's not really going into a lot of detail. Level 3 is where we need to be at a minimum. Students make connections across the text by identifying similar or different uses of language, content, or context. So now we can see we're actually talking about comparisons of the methods that a writer uses, the things that are available within the text. Individual choices of language, might be talking about lexis, might be talking about word choice, might be talking about sentences, syntax, phrases, clauses. Could be about meaning, could be about semantics, all things like that. It could be about metaphor. Similarly, anything that we class as language, we've got connections across the text by identifying similar or different uses, so comparing or contrasting. Level 4, doing the same thing again, but this time also linking it to context. So bringing in the idea that both of these texts were for different contexts. One is written by the Prime Minister and is designed for the whole public, whereas the other one is designed It's part of a community discussion message board. So it's about the actual public responding to other members of the public. So again, talking about context. By default and by its nature, this will be more detailed because you're talking about opinions, you're talking about how it represents groups of people, how it represents bigger issues in society. And that's what we mean by discourse. So discourse is effectively means any of the ways that a text will talk about society, how it will raise issues, how it will question things, how it will bring up ideas of ethics, morality, things like that, or representation, equality, things like that. So again, it's linking it all together. And then level 5, exploring the significance of connections are found across the text. So again, just like before, but this time saying why that's significant in that particular text. So what we'll do is we'll work our way through this. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about level 1 and level 2 things as a default, as a given, because you can't compare something properly without doing level 1 and level 2. But I'm going to really start at level 3 and consider how language is used, because that's what we're watching the video for. Okay, so simple things first about the context. The Boris Johnson letter is obviously in the written mode. It's official government discourse and it's designed for the whole UK public, whereas the Mumsnet thread is on a message board. The users who post on it can be anybody, they can be anonymous, and it's public access. Anybody can do it. You don't have to be qualified to post on it. It's different context entirely. So you're going to have a very particular public relations aspect in the letter, whereas in Mumsnet, it's essentially anything goes as long as it meets the community guidelines. The genre, so the genre of both texts. First one, it's an instructional notice, but it also has elements that make it a little bit like a personal letter. So we'll talk about that in terms of tone and how Boris actually refers to things. So it's a little bit of a hybrid genre, a little bit of a hybrid register between those two things. So it's instructional, but also it's got elements of personal, emotive aspects to it. The genre of the Mumsnet post. Firstly, it's asynchronous. It's not a chat room, so they are posting one after another, and there's a time gap between them. So the producers, the people who actually send the messages, don't know how people are going to respond to them straight away. But also you've got the fact that anybody can respond to it. It's anonymous. In terms of the topic, that is set by the first person. So just like with Boris, with his letter, he set the topic. In terms of Mumsnet, the topic is set by the original poster. So with that, we can say that's part of the genre because they decide what the topic is. Audience, very, very different. The letter was for the whole UK public, so everyone who was living in a house received it. Every British household received it, so it couldn't be any more open and democratic. It's meant to be for everybody. Whereas the Mumsnet post, obviously you have to be a member of Mumsnet to access it. You don't have to be logged on to actually read it, because that's how I've accessed it. I'm not on Mumsnet. And it has to appeal to a certain type of, and when we talk about the text, we'll talk about there's a lot of anger within the text, and in the sense that it's rallying the community against people who are breaking lockdowns. That's really important. Subject and purpose. So we'll talk about this together because it's most useful. So for the Boris text, it's instructing people, it's giving really firm instructions, and it's saying you have to obey these rules. This is the procedure for lockdown. So the purpose is to say, you must do it. We are the government. So even that is a discourse of authority, of government being in charge, of paternalism, what's called when the government knows best. And then we've got the subject and purpose of the second text, which is expressing frustration at lockdown, expressing frustration at the public who aren't taking it seriously, and to try and rally support around them and say, yes, everybody should agree with me, because that's normally how Mumsnet works. It's a message board that's not going to people's houses. So the context of people access Mumsnet to learn about the discussions that are going on. They give a lot of opinions, they express their own experiences, and they talk about it. It's almost like a support group, but it's a lot more open. It's not a specialized support group. It's not like a therapy group. It is designed to be like a democratic, diplomatic discussion board. So the first level we could use to compare is the use of emotion. The bits that I've highlighted aren't the only things you could talk about. I know I've mentioned a lot, and I've highlighted it a lot, but you could talk about more things. I've picked this up in particular because both texts are trying to persuade, and we know that persuasive texts will use the rhetorical devices of ethos, logos, and pathos 9 times out of 10. So what we can say is that they both use this. They do it in different ways, and we've got different approaches being used in different discourses. So, for example, we've got some metaphors in the Boris letter to the idea that you can combat coronavirus. So that's an emotive verb being used. So combat is a transitive verb, and it means to do something to fight it. You have to have an object. You can't just combat by itself. You've got to combat something. So firstly, it's a metaphor, and it's emotive because it's got the idea that you're fighting, and also has that connotation of war, because if you're in combat, you might have casualties. So linking that idea together, again, brings the idea of pathos. One of the examples in the letter, everyday life has changed dramatically. So this is interesting because we've got the idea that it's changed. So we've got that past participle, changed. It's saying it's already happened. So Boris is saying that all of the problems, or all of the difficulties of lockdown as a result of coronavirus, life has changed already, so we can't go back. So by using this in present perfect tense, it says you cannot go back to normality because life has changed. And also that's post-modified by the adverb dramatically. So it's really emphasizing the seriousness of it. Because part of the rhetoric of this letter is saying, I know some people don't believe that lockdown is important, but it is important. And why? Is because life has changed dramatically, not just life has changed. We've got that modifier there that describes the severity of it. Another modifier that goes with that, what type of impact is it? It's a profound impact. So in this example, we've got a pre-modifying adjective. So a profound impact, again, emphasizes the idea that we are stuck in this situation. It's unprecedented. We've never been in this situation before, apart from maybe in wartime. More emotive techniques that are used, we've got our loved ones, so protect our loved ones. So loved ones, obviously, it's a fixed expression. It means family and friends. You can talk about the pre-modifying adjective, loved, that modifies ones. But then we've also got, in this example, our, which is interesting. And I've highlighted that because it's first person, it's inclusive, it includes the reader. So it's Boris and the reader. And it's a possessive determiner. And a possessive determiner in that noun phrase tells us that we have loved ones. They belong to us. So that possessive determiner is phrased to include the reader and to say this is an emotional issue that doesn't just affect me, it affects you. And vice versa, it also affects Boris. You've got repetition of the adjective right quite a bit. And again, that links into the emotion of ethos and saying we are correct, we are right to do this. Right measures, right time, right preparations. This repetition of the pre-modifying adjective right creates that sort of authority and the authenticity of what Boris is saying and suggesting. Another metaphor that's been used quite a lot. Again, you've got this sort of warlike, fighting, beating, defeating sort of language that's used. Again, that is a discourse that a country can beat a virus. So beat the virus, you've got that example there. Truly inspirational, again, another adverb being used to say it's truly inspirational for the NHS to deal with the virus. We can beat it together. So again, that repetition of that verb, again, another example of transitive verb, beat, combat. And then an interesting verb choice that he uses as well, we've got I urge you. So he's not just saying I demand it, I command it, it's necessary. He's using a very emotive verb. In this case, another transitive verb that says it's really important, I urge you to do it. In terms of meaning, you might think about why he chose that particular verb. So urge is different to ask. It's to press upon somebody, to present and speak earnestly, to repeatedly plead with them, to say, it's not begging. It's to really, demand them to comply. But again, it's not got that negativity of I command you to do it. So in terms of denotation, it's clear what he's saying, but also in connotation, it's got this idea of I'm on your side, I'm doing it for your benefit. And that is a discourse because it's suggesting that the government knows what's best for the country. And that's all tied into that meaning there. So in terms of semantics, you can talk about that. And obviously emotion, it's a very emotional issue, lockdown. And this text is almost saying, we have to work through it together. I urge you to do it because it's necessary. So the way it represents the government's authority is that the government's authority is absolute. Now, in contrast, in the Mumsnet article, there is emotive language, but it's a very different approach. So they both use emotive phrases. In the Mumsnet article, it does it because it wants to show the anger and the frustration that the poster has. They're saying, why is nobody else taking it seriously? I'm angry. So some of the phrases that we've got, they seem to think that we're in a paid staycation. So we can explore this a little bit. Firstly, we've got the mental verb seem. So the writer, the original poster, is talking about what people think. They think that they're on holiday. They're not in a lockdown because of a global pandemic. So you've got the mental verb seem. Why is that important? Because thoughts can be changed. Thoughts can be wrong. And they're implying that the people's thoughts are wrong, that they're not taking it seriously. You've got some really short declaratives like, it's crazy. Really an emotive, emphatic sentence to use. Even just using the word crazy suggests that they're sick to the back teeth of people's responses to it. Crazy is dysphonistic. It's meant to sound negative. It's meant to sound that people have lost their minds. Had this just been in plain English, it would have been, it's selfish and it's inappropriate to have family meetings and holidays, blah, blah, blah. But they say it's crazy, so they're really using hyperbole here. So they're using a dysphonism, saying crazy, which again is emotive because hyperbole relies on emotion. Another declarative that gets used, people are taking advantage. So again, interesting here, we've got the hypernym, people, to talk about people as a general whole, a general group of people, so not individuals. And that is again hyperbole because it's emphasizing that everybody's doing it. You've got the idea that they are taking advantage. If we look at tense here, they are taking advantage. So it's present continuous tense. You've got the present participle, taking, and people are doing it. So it's continuous, it's still happening. And that creates that element of urgency. She's saying this isn't stopping. People need to stop. People largely seem to be doing what they want. Yes. So again, the writer's giving their own opinion. And again, we've got that repetition of the mental verb seem that says people are thinking about their own responsibilities or the lack of responsibility. People are thinking about their own interests. They're not interested in the good of the community. So in terms of emotion, in terms of how that's presented, what we can say now is how that translates to what discourses and what representations are clear in the text and how do they compare. So for the Boris letter, there's a discourse of minimising deaths in the pandemic being both an emotive and a moral issue. It relies on patriotism, grit, like national grit, we're all in this together, keep calm, carry on, all that stuff. A love for family and a love for our community. It urges the public to share his view. He's persuading people to have the same worldview that he has. But also it humanises Boris Johnson and wants the reader to think that he does care. He's a leader, obviously in a political sense, but the letter is saying, I'm a leader, I'm a moral leader as well, because I've got to get you on board and get you to agree. Great British public, you've got to agree with me. So he wants everybody to be part of a team, a collaborative approach to fixing this public health problem. So it humanises him and makes him more like a community leader as opposed to a prime minister. Whereas in the other text, the discourse is not about that. The discourse is about very categorically anger. It's judgment. It's anger at people who are taking liberties with social distancing. It's saying people aren't doing it properly. In terms of pragmatics, we've got some interesting speech acts. All of these are judgments and assessments of people that they see. What we call the verdictive, giving a verdict, verdictive speech acts, how the original poster is judging their neighbours. And again, using that hypernym people, he's talking about the public at large. He's talking about everybody. This represents that the public, or in their opinion, the public are selfish, they're unpatriotic, they're immoral. So that's how all of these things kind of can be compared. First one, emotive language, really easy one to talk about. The next thing we can talk about is how both texts have modality. Now, every text has modality. The use of modal verbs, the use of assumed agreements and given knowledge between the writer and the reader. What we'll talk about here is how that's very particular in the first text, because it's instructions from an authority figure, and they use modal verbs. And in fact, one of the modal verbs is put in bold, so it's given that intensity, got intensification being used. For example, Boris writes, "You must stay at home." So in that short declarative sentence, the emphasis is on the modal verb must. So it's about necessity. It's about people must do it. Modal verbs are helpful to talk about because what they say is that it shows the authority of the speaker, because they're, if you agree that you must stay at home, then you automatically assume that the authority of the speaker is absolute. I say speaker, we know what I mean. I mean Boris, who's writing the letter. But by using a modal verb, it creates this idea that they are in charge. You should not meet your friends. So again, another modal verb being used. Again, these are in declarative sentences that effectively work out to be commands. You may only leave your home. So in this case, we've got it modified by only. So we've got a qualification. You can only leave your home if. You should ensure. Rules must be observed. So again, all of this in terms of the modal verbs being used, really strong, really authority-driven discourse, i.e. Boris is in charge, Boris and the government tell us what to do. In contrast, in the second text, in Mumsnet, modality is used, and there is modality in the text, and there's lots of presupposition, i.e. what the writer has produced, the reader has to agree with anyway, because they're more likely to click on it if they've read this sort of title for a thread. There's no point in lockdown anymore. Again, I know there's no modal verb there, but it is a presupposition because it implies something, i.e. the public can't be trusted. Lockdown has gone, it's not worked because the public are irresponsible. The fact that it's an absolute, no point, there is no point. Everyone around where I live, explaining it's everyone, again, another hypernym. Everyone. So it's not just saying these particular people, it's generalizing and it's using hyperbole. It's slightly dehumanizing the public as well because it's referring to them just as everyone. It's not talking about individual examples of why people might have to meet up. There's no point. What is the point? Again, this repetition, this cohesion of the phrase, the point, no point, really emphasizes that they've got strong emotions, but not just it's emotive, but that it's presupposed that the reader would agree with that because it's a phrase that they would say, yes, I agree, there's no point. So in text A, by using this modality and this amount of modal verbs, there's a discourse of the government being the authority. They are the absolute authority in this field. They're in charge. The commands are phrased as absolute. This represents the unprecedented scale of the problem and the severity of breaking the rules. So it makes it really clear you have to follow these rules. Whereas in the text B, the discourse is instead that the government's authority was ineffective. The user, the original poster who's called Life Matters, from what they've witnessed, they think there's no point. It didn't work. So there's a presupposition of these statements representing that lockdown is futile. So as a reader, you would agree with them. You would bring their ideas to the text because you would agree, because that's how it's understood. Or the ideal reader would be like that. So what the text represents is that lockdown is futile because of people's selfishness. So it makes that really clear, talking about where people are meeting, everyone is doing it, there's no point. So because it's an absolute, it's a different type of absolute to what the government say. This is the absolute that says there is literally absolutely no point. Another language feature that's quite easy to spot because you can normally work it out from the word if. Conditionals. So conditional sentences are effectively sentences that talk about cause and effect. So if you do this, I will do that. What they allow you to do is show the consequences of things. So in the Boris text, one example that jumps out is if too many people become seriously unwell. So again, that sentence is phrased by foregrounding the fact that people would become unwell. The adjective unwell, using that bound morpheme un, obviously tells us that's the consequence. That's what we don't want. And seriously, that adverb is modifying unwell, really adding to the gravitas, the severity and the urgency of the problem. If too many people, so it's explaining the logic of it now. This is where logos comes into a text. So it's explaining this is the reason why, this is the fact. If too many people become seriously unwell. And later on it says, so if people break the rules. So again, if you're using if in a clause, it's probably going to be a conditional. And that tells us that it is explaining the reason why. In contrast, text B does use conditional, but actually it uses it to say what's the point if people are not following it anymore. So in this example, it's focusing on the effect. It's not focusing on the actual the cause of something. It's focusing on nobody's following it anyway. So in terms of discourses, in terms of how these are represented, we can talk about them. So text A, there's a discourse of the morality for the reader. They have to understand the moral obligation they have, that they have a moral obligation. It's required of them during this pandemic. The if clause spells out the cause and effect. If you do this, we'll save people's lives. If you don't do this, people will die. So this is using the rhetoric of pathos, again, because it's emotive, but also logos, because it's explaining the facts. And it represents that anybody who would break the rules is immoral, and also because of the other types of language that gets used, all the lexical choices related to patriotism. If you break the rules, then you are unpatriotic. Whereas in the Boris text, the discourse is of anger, as we've already talked about, not because of lockdown itself, but anger at people who are not considering the needs of their community. The individuals who are doing this, who are breaking lockdown, they are not considering the needs of the country as a whole. The implicature in the verb phrase, they're not following it anymore, shows that the rules of lockdown, or policing the rules of lockdown, didn't work. They're ineffective. Or maybe the novelty of lockdown is worn off, in the opinion of the writer of Life Matters. And again, they use a conditional in a different way. Obviously, the context of that is important because it's an open discussion, whereas the letter is saying there can't be any open, honest discussion about this. This is what needs to be done. And again, you can think about the difference in the genres that come with that. The next point of comparison we can make is how both texts use metonymy. So metonymy, like metaphor, is referring to something as if it's something else. But metonymy is when you refer to one part as part of a greater whole. So referring to your boss as the suit. Suit is what he wears, but that's not what a boss is. So it's representing it. This text does it in terms of Boris because he talks about the NHS as if it's a cohesive single unit. The NHS will be unable to cope. So firstly, that's personification because it applies this idea of ability and capacity in very human terms by unable to cope. That's quite colloquial as well because it shows about kind of mental resilience. So that connotation is there. The government will do whatever it takes. Again, this is a really straightforward metonym. So when you refer to the government as a whole, not an individual department or an individual unit within the government, then that's metonymy. The government will do whatever it takes. Again, interesting use of future tense here, future simple tense. The government will do whatever it takes. So again, the absolute authority. So the representation of the government as an absolute authority in combating coronavirus. And another example of metonymy, the great British spirit. This kind of links into that idea of we're all part of the great British spirit with the great British nation, and that we can kind of coalesce and we can work together. Extra connotations here, definitely of wartime. The great British spirit kind of has similar collocations to the war effort, keep calm, carry on, that sort of thing. So it kind of links it all together. So on a semantic level, so we're not just talking about individual words, we're talking about meaning and those semantic fields that link things together. You've got that allusion to wartime, you've got that allusion to the army, the allusion to fighting and combating an enemy. Really big example in text B, the writer says, I don't want us to be making the country suffer anymore. Again, referring to the country as it's one thing and not an abstract concept, the country. So again, another example of metonymy. And in this case, the very same way it's been done is personification. And we can use that verb in particular, making the country suffer anymore. So as a suffering, a mental verb, a country can't suffer. So this is a rhetorical technique to kind of link in that idea of patriotic behaviour or unpatriotic behaviour. So this poster is saying people are acting unpatriotic and therefore that's damaging the country. So how do we compare these for the answer? So we could talk about how in text A there's a discourse of individual people being part of a larger patriotic collective. So the NHS, the government, the great British nation. We have to be part of a collective to beat this pandemic. So this represents the idea as someone who is patriotic. It does actually presuppose the idea that you have to like the British public and you have to want Britain to succeed. Not in a war, but obviously in terms of public health. So regardless of your political views, regardless of your political allegiance, your creed, your colour, whatever it may be, they're saying we're all in this together. You probably know that phrase from David Cameron. And you've also got the idea that in the text, it's rallying people to be on the same political, not political, but rhetorical view. We're all in the same army fighting this thing. So you have to be patriotic, regardless of what it is. And in particular, you've got an interesting noun phrase here, that great British spirit. You've got the demonstrative determiner that, saying which one is it? It's that one. That itself is a reference to, we know there is a great British spirit. So Boris is kind of summoning it from the history, summoning it from the past and saying we will use that great, not the great British spirit, that great British spirit. That is a sort of intertextual reference to wartime texts. So anything that relates to war, that relates to patriotism, and how that kind of alludes to it. And that's where we can talk about the kind of finer points of noun phrases, because that determiner, that, is very specific. It's a definite one, and it's what we call a demonstrative. Whereas in text B, obviously it's the opposite. It's saying people aren't doing that. They're not being patriotic. So the discourse is of individual people damaging the larger collective. They're being unpatriotic. And therefore this represents the idea that people are hurting the country, and again using personification, and therefore by extension the implication is that the UK public cannot be trusted with public health. So again the context is different because one's a letter, the other one is a message board, one is instructions, the other one is discussion. The negative opinion of text B is really clear there in how it's presented. Next part jumped out a lot to me in the first text because even though he's the Prime Minister and you would expect a certain level of formality, in Boris's communications, in his videos, in his interviews, as you will know, there's a persona of informality, and he creates this sort of friendly, jovial, sometimes clownish, not serious, very clownish approach. And this letter's funny because there's a very casual tone, there's a sort of conversational tone, we'll look at it with some of the examples, but it underpins this really serious message, which is ultimately, I am the Prime Minister and I'm telling you what to do. So how does he do that? A little bit of colloquial language, a little bit of friendly, casual tone that goes with it, and again it adds to his rhetoric, because part of the ethos of a politician now, especially a very populist politician who wants to get everybody on side and wants to appeal to the widest political spectrum they can, from the right and the left, and the center of the political spectrum, is by using the language of the layman, the language of colloquial life. So one example, it's important for me to level with you. So again, that's an idiom. To level with somebody is an idiom that means to be honest, to be sincere, to be perhaps tell them some information they don't want to hear. So again, it's saying in that declarative sentence, it's important for me to level with you. It is synthetic personalization because he's speaking to you as an individual, even though it's been sent out to millions of people. To level with you says a very casual conversational tone through that idiom. Help you make ends meet, again, another metaphor, another idiom in this case, again, speaking to you individually. We've got the second person pronoun you, so it's directly addressing the listener, or the reader in this case. Put food on the table. So again, obviously this is talking about a much wider economic problem that lockdown will cause. And the government is saying, we will still, we'll be that paternal force. We will represent, this text represents the idea that the government are a paternal force who will look after the public, they will put food on the table. Again, that phrase is an idiom. Put food on the table is a fixed expression that means you will have money to buy food. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say we will give you money to buy food, or we will, ensure you've got a scheme that allows you to buy food. It says put food on the table, which is a colloquial, idiomatic expression. The NHS is working flat out. Again, another casual conversational phrase. And then the needs of the hour. Again, another example of idiom. In contrast, obviously the context of text B is very different. The tone allows for this sort of conversational tone, but we do actually have this in the second post that she makes, where she says, or he says, "Sorry for the typos, I rushed into uploading this." So we've got that interesting phatic word, sorry, for the typos. It's almost like they're acknowledging in a sort of meta way, they're acknowledging what they've already written. So they're commenting on the text. So it is technically an intertextual reference to what's already been posted, because both of those texts would count as separate texts. And you could say if there's any intertextual references between them. You could also refer to it as anaphora. So I rushed into uploading this. So that particular pronoun is referring back to the text. So again, it's another example of anaphor, because it's a word that links to something else in the text, or in this case, in the previous text. So what can we say about that in terms of discourse? We can say that in the first text, Boris, as the producer of this text, whether he wrote it himself 100% or whether he had a team of letter writers and he, it doesn't matter, we just refer to him as Boris. He's trying to humanize himself in his rhetoric. So we're talking about pathos again, we're talking about emotion and ethos, because it's about, do we trust, how trustworthy is Boris as a speaker or a writer, with this conversational or casual register. So we think about Martin Juice and think about that scale of how friendly things are, so from frozen to formal, consultative, casual, intimate. These phrases, now obviously they're only choice phrases here and there that kind of like interspersed throughout the text, create this tone of casual conversational friendliness and therefore trust, because Boris wants you to believe him. He's telling you the truth. Why does it do this? Because it represents a rhetoric of populism. He wants to be popular with everybody. His persona is a politician who understands the needs of the everyman, and can be female, obviously, a layperson. So part of Boris's PR brand is that he's not just for the elites, he's for everyone in the public. Therefore, using this conversational language creates this rhetoric of, I'm a human just like you. This creates humanity. It's the opposite of dehumanization, when you take away humanity from something by how you describe them. This makes him seem extra human. So this represents the idea that lockdown is part of humanity's battle against coronavirus, regardless of what your politics are. Everybody, it's not party political, everybody's involved in this, and everybody has to stand up to it. Whereas in the second text, the conversational tone is still visible, but it's in the second post, and that actually shows that they are apologizing. They're using a phatic token. So phatic language is important in terms of pragmatics, i.e. the social rules of language, so what we can and can't say. Obviously, if you've got a few typos, then in terms of standard English being corrected, then commenting with a typo, saying sorry for the typos, by using that, says that this is an ongoing discussion. It's an ongoing, not a working document, because it has been posted, it has been published, but it shows that there's a discourse of politeness being important. So part of the pragmatic rules of Mumsnet is politeness is important. Good English, standard English, punctuation, spelling and grammar obviously is important. And it's what we call a face protecting act. They're trying to protect their own face, and say, oh, I know I've made a few mistakes, but I'm sorry. So what we can say that is that there's a discourse of Mumsnet itself having a role of politeness, using phatic language, showing kind of diplomatic approaches to how you can have a discussion. Freedom of speech as well that goes in it, because obviously the views are very strong. This represents that obviously it's emotive, and it shows that as an individual user, so we always link it back to context. This is an individual user on this message board. They got really angry. It's a very emotive topic. It's really emphatic, and that caused them to type it out quickly in anger, and they acknowledge that. So that's a very different context to what the Boris letter was, because obviously that letter has been proofread and planned and proofread and drafted probably dozens of times, because the context of how they're both produced is different. Final thing we'll look at in terms of language, and again, with all these language things, you may have already mentioned these. This was question 1 or question 2. Obviously, what we've looked at today is how to compare the texts and how they name and describe and equate and all that stuff. But in terms of how this would all come together, tense will get you more marks because it is more difficult. In terms of picking up on it, there are some tenses that are easier to talk about than others. I'll talk about some straightforward ones here. You'll be able to see whether it's future or present. So we've got, in this example, the use of future tense in the Boris letter. So we've got, in 9 times out of 10, we've got an auxiliary verb, which is a modal verb. We must, we will, we can. And then you've got the participle afterwards. So we must slow the spread of the infinitive straight after. So we must slow the spread of the disease. That's talking about the future. Life can return to normal, again, talking about the future. We will beat it together. So again, linking that verb to the future tense, saying if we bite the bullet now and do all the work now, then it'll be fixed in the future. We can beat it. We will beat it. So this has a discourse of the future being certain and that we will return to normal, which I hope we do. Obviously, I'm speaking now in July and things haven't returned to normal yet. This represents the actions of the government will result in a positive resolution. Therefore, we should believe it. So the context of the text is to persuade people. How does it do it? It promises a brighter future. Whatever the government does in terms of lockdown, in terms of the measures that we have, it will result in a positive future for us. And that represents the idea that therefore the government knows best. Again, that idea of a paternal government who control everything, and we have to do what they say. Why? Because they're going to give us the future that we want. Whereas in the second text, we're not talking about the future. He or she is talking about things that are happening now. So we've got the use of present continuous tense. People are having picnics. So why is that important? Firstly, they're looking at it, they're seeing it, they're looking out the window and seeing it. It doesn't have to be right then and there, but it's in the present, so it's a definite time. It's not in the future. They're not talking about potentials or hypotheticals. They're talking about actual definite things that have happened. The fact it's in continuous, you've got that ing suffix, that inflection, have to having, which makes it continuous, tells us that it's not stopping, it's continuing. And that creates that sort of urgency, i.e. we have to stop it. And then you've got, like, even in the simple phrase, it's crazy. You've got, present simple tense. It is. So obviously it's a contraction. It is from it's. So that tells us they're talking about the here and now. So this use of present simple and present continuous tense represents the insistence of the writer. They want to fix the behavior of people who are disobeying the rules, and it's happening right now. So all of these examples in terms of language show how we can compare the ways that texts do different things in the same way or different ways. Obviously, these texts were very, very different, even though they were ultimately about the same field. They were about lockdown. So what we'll do now is look at a typical answer you could write in 20 minutes. This is comparing and contrasting text A and text B, which we've done, looking at how they are similar and different in their language use. Okay, so firstly, we'll talk about what time we should spend on it. So it's a 20-mark question, so roughly 20 to 23 or 24 minutes. You've read both texts, and we know that text A is the letter from the government and text B is the Mumsnet post. So every time I've used a language feature that we've discussed already in the notes, I've put it in orange. As you can see, there are a lot, but I've still only mentioned some of the ones we talked about previously. It's important that you know how many language features you can talk about and how you can embed them in your sentences. Like I said, the more you bring up the context and the more you bring up the production and who the text is for and the purpose and the genre of writing, the better your score will be. Text A uses a strong emotive rhetoric to position the audience as sympathetic to the demands of lockdown because obeying the new rules will enable the UK to combat the coronavirus. The transitive verb combat is used as a wartime metaphor and represents that lockdown is a moral and emotive issue for the whole nation. Not only is an authority figure, the Prime Minister, writing a personal letter, a discourse normally reserved for events of great importance, to everyone in the country, they are evoking the patriotism and national effort required to protect our loved ones. In this quote, the use of the possessive determiner our denotes the viewpoint that lockdown is vital for everyone because it's inclusive, and its purpose is an absolute necessity, which represents the discourse of the government being paternal and a force for good. Text B takes the opposing view that the public are unable to obey this authority, and does this in an open discussion board on the Mumsnet website. In a declarative sentence, people are taking advantage. The writer implies that lockdown rules have been ineffective because there are so many flouting the rules. In the context of Text B's production, an online anonymous discourse community, or you might say computer-mediated community, this use of the hypernym people blames as wide a selection of the population as possible, and could also be seen as hyperbolic, or an overreaction to the actions of the few. Lexis from the semantic field of leisure also is repeated to express this anger. People are in a paid staycation, doing what they want, taking advantage, which all express the perspectives of the user, life matters, that's their name, as being important because of this cohesion in their discourse, because they keep repeating it. The blend of stay and vacation also stands out as a face-threatening act on those the poster is aiming their anger at, so they're blaming them. This neologism, i.e. the blend word, staycation, in another text would normally have a positive connotation, but here it's ironic. Text A represents the authority of the government as absolute through modality. You must stay at home. This declarative serves as a command with the modal verb must, in bold, emboldened, and it acts as a form of intensification in the sentence. In terms of graphology, this use of bold font emphasises the authority of the writer. In contrast, text B contains multiple presuppositions that the author of the government is ineffective, or the authority of the government is ineffective. The declarative, there's no point, and the rhetorical question, what's the point, both serve to create a cohesive argument that lockdown has failed, but this relies on the presupposition shared by an ideal reader, who would be sympathetic to the writer's perspective. Therefore, it could be argued that in the context of a message board, they are preaching to the choir. There is a shared inference between the producer and the other participants in the thread. The writer is positioning themselves on the same level of anger and judgment through these vindictive speech acts. So they're saying they're on the same level as everybody else. Everybody's angry. Finally, both texts represent particular periods of time, but for different purposes. Boris uses future simple tense to promise we will beat it together, which again links cohesively to the presupposition that the government's authority is absolute, because they can beat it. The epistemic modal verb will reinforces the promise that the virus can be beat. In contrast, text B uses present tense to decry what is happening in the present time, i.e. people are having picnics, which uses present continuous tense to complain that the immoral actions of the public are ongoing and need to be policed. So as you can see, 3 paragraphs, they're quite meaty. We've got language effects regularly discussed, and we are talking about different levels, talking about lexis, talking about grammar, talking about pragmatics where we can. The more of the language frameworks you can include, the more points you will get, as long as you are referring to differences and similarities in the way that the texts do things. What's important is that you are explaining language and not just spotting it. Just like GCSE, you're not just saying they both have emotive language, we're saying why and what effects they have.